Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, An Assessment in Action, the Carnegie Elective Classification for Community Engagement. I'd like to welcome George, who is the co-founder and CEO of GivePulse, to give us a brief welcome.
Thanks so much, Lauren, and hello, everyone. My name is George Luke, CEO and co-founder of GivePulse, a technology platform to coordinate, track, and assess all community engagement activity. It's such a privilege to be with great company here. Even more, we're honored to be thought partners to determine how to best leverage technology to amplify the access, research potential, and international scale with the Carnegie classification team. A little housekeeping before I pass this off to Lauren. I wanted to let you know that we do have this webinar recorded and it will be shared back to those attending in this call. As with all the webinars, there is a Q&A section and a comment section, which I'm sure the panel would love to answer over time. And so throughout the discussion, feel free to chat and ask questions via the Q&A. Thank you again for the opportunity, and I look forward to innovating and doing the hard work with you all.
Thanks so much, George. And yes, as a reminder, the Q&A function will be going through the chat. Please ask any questions and we'll be happy to answer them as time is allotted. And the webinar will be available afterwards on the Commission on Public Purpose and Higher Education's website. You'll also be muted throughout the webinar. Please let me introduce our panelists. First, we have Dr. Matthew Johnson, who is president of Albion College and is the co-director of the Elective Classification for Community Engagement. Dr. Marisol Morales, who is vice president for Network Leadership and Campus Compact. Dr. John Saltmarsh, who is professor of higher education at UMass Boston and co-director of the Elective Classification for Community Engagement. And I am Lauren Barchi, the associate director of the Commission on Public Purpose and Higher Education at Albion College, and I'm the primary contact for Elective Classification for Community Engagement. A brief overview of our webinar today. We will address preparation for both first-time applicants and campuses that are reclassifying, and will include an overview of the 2024 classification timeline, lessons learned from the 2020 classification cycle, a review of assessment within the 2024 frameworks, and strategies that have been effective for successful applicants. Dr. Johnson, take it away.
All right. Looking for that cell phone commercial, right? Can you hear me now? Thank you all. Thank you, Lauren, and thank you, John, for letting me know that I was muted. So as you can see here on the slide, the new application cycle begins in January. We will be releasing the new framework that has been revised, and we look forward to receiving the completed applications by the time they are due. And that is on April 15th. So you have a little over a year as a campus to work through the process. We're going to talk about several elements of that process today, and we're excited to see new applications come in over the next year and a half. We recognize the challenges that have been faced by many institutions as they have dealt with COVID over the past year and continue to deal with COVID on their campuses. We've heard from many of you that this has had a significant impact. In some cases, positive impact on the recognition of the importance for community engagement in your community. And in other cases, you're facing cuts to budgets and personnel for community engagement. We'll be asking questions about that in the new framework, and we'll be taking those impacts into consideration as we receive the applications in this cycle. We also are aware that the impacts of global warming, the threats to democracy, and the struggles for racial equity and justice in our community are live and real in the lives of our institutions and in the lives of the staff and students who people our institutions. And so we do have questions in this cycle that do address those issues, and we'll be looking for how campuses are dealing with and moving through those issues in their communities. And so we begin then with the definition of community engagement. This is perhaps the bedrock of the classification for the foundation, and it's in two parts. The first part is a definition of the process of engagement. That engagement describes the collaboration between the institution and larger communities, mostly in the form of and context of partnerships with those communities and with entities in those communities that are mutually beneficial and see the exchange of resources and knowledge. And this is fundamental to the definition, that we recognize that knowledge exists outside the academy, and that true community engagement recognizes that knowledge and values that knowledge as contributory to ongoing knowledge creation in a co-creative process between the institution and their partners. The second part of the definition really speaks to the purpose of engagement. And as the foundation's full name is for the advancement of teaching, this is really about how the engagement shapes not only the students to become active citizens and tackle challenges faced by publics, but also how the engagement shapes the institution. Because we know that when community engagement is done well and done deeply, it transforms the teaching, the learning, and the scholarship within the institution. It transforms the institution, and that's the purpose of the engagement.
Okay, I just want to pick up and do a little bit of an overview of the application. So this slide just gives you some numbers. And I think what I would focus on here, and all of this is available on the website as well, is the total number of classified institutions. You can see in 2015, it's 361. 2020, it's 359. The other thing you can look at here is the number of campuses that reclassify and also that need to reclassify. So those campuses that have the classification from 2015 are now in the process of needing to reclassify if they want to retain the classification. Can you hop to the next slide?
I'm wondering if we could do the poll before we.
Yeah. George, can you do that?
So we wanted to get a sense of who was joining us, and great. Thank you all for sharing that.
Do you want to say anything about the poll, Marisol?
Sure. We wanted to get a sense of who was joining us today, and kind of where we should direct some of the questions and what we're going to be sharing. So this is really helpful to see that most folks are coming as part of reclassification. So happy to talk about that in some more detail as we get into the Q&A portion of it. I'll turn it back to you, John.
That's great. Thanks, Marisol. So what I'm talking about here is how reviewers are looking at applications. And I think it's helpful for applicants to be sort of thinking about this as you put together an application. So one thing to keep in mind, this is a holistic review. And part of what I mean by that is that there's not a set of questions or a single question that if you don't have the appropriate evidence, it's going to sink your application. They aren't read that way. Reviewers don't treat them that way. It's looking across the entire application. Secondly, what reviewers are looking for is evidence of institutionalization. Is this work, the community engagement work, deeply embedded into the cultures, structures, practices of the institution? And I mean that in terms of across the institution, not programs here and there, or not units or departments, but are really across the institution. Another point to keep in mind, and given there are a number of reclass folks on this call, you've done this before, the application is really asking some focused questions on whether or not community engagement is embedded into the academic culture of the institution. And what I mean by that is, does it fundamentally affect faculty work, student learning, and the curriculum? And I say that in part because if a campus approaches community engagement singularly as, for instance, economic development, they may do really well in terms of their economic development work, but it doesn't touch the work of faculty or students. And so it's not going to work well with the application. So that's what we mean in terms of focusing on and embedding it in the academic core. Another part is around creating a coherent institutional narrative. So what I mean by that is that reviewers are looking for this, for your application in a sense, to tell a story about your institution. And that story has to have a coherence to it, so that when a reviewer is reading it, they can understand from beginning to end how this all fits together. Go to the next slide, because we can kind of pick up on that too. Reviewers are looking for alignment. So this is related to that question around coherence. And what I mean by that is that if there's evidence provided in one area that aligns with evidence that's provided in another area. And the example we give here is around mission and strategic planning. So in the mission area, if community engagement is absolutely fundamentally central to the mission of the institution, but then when the reviewer gets to the question around strategic plans, and there's nothing in the strategic plan around community engagement, it's just hard to understand how these things work together. And then reviewers are sort of thinking about this question of misalignment of the responses. And then another thing just to keep in mind is that the classification is for work done, not work that is planned on being done. In other words, evidence for engagement that's happening, not engagement that's aspired to. You can go to the next slide. I'm going to turn it over to Marisol here to talk about these areas for continuous improvement.
Great, thanks, John. So we're going to cover some specific areas around continuous improvement, particularly infrastructure, community partnerships, curricular engagement, faculty rewards, community engagement, and historically or systematically excluded students and faculty, and then assessment. And what I'm going to be doing also is sharing a bit of my own experience, having done the classification for my institution when I was at the University of Laverne, and what that kind of entailed for me. Next slide. So really, what we want you to think about when you are building your team for the Carnegie application is thinking about the architecture for engagement, matching the commitments to the communities, the students, and the faculty work. So that coordination and connection. And then thinking about a coordinating infrastructure. So who are the folks who are going to come together and build that team that will help you look across campus to think about what aspects of the work, not only in the centralized location that maybe the community engagement office is located, but also folks from across campus, maybe the provost's office or student affairs, that can help bring together the holistic story of the community engagement that is occurring at your campus. And lastly, with looking at issue-based engagement going on in academic departments, interdisciplinary centers, curricular and co-curricular units. So really, again, being able to get a holistic story together that conveys the depth and levels of commitment and institutionalization of community engagement across your campus. Next slide. Community partnerships. I also think this also can relate to the previous slide regarding infrastructure, thinking about also the voice of the community as you're putting together your team as well. And for the Carnegie application, the community partnership is really at the core of the foundation's community engagement classification. So really the intentional practices around reciprocity and mutuality. And this is really best told by the community partners that you have. And so one of the things that we did in the last round was get the letters from community partners. And those told us as reviewers the real stories, and we were able to see whether there was a connection or a disconnect between what the community partners were saying and what the institution was saying about the engagement work. So thinking really about the centrality of the community partners, the ones that you list, and urging institutions to pay attention to this aspect within the application. I'm really thinking also about the differences in community partnerships that you have across campus, and showing that diversity in partnerships in the application as well. Next slide. Curricular engagement. Really, this is about the robustness of the curricular engagement that is happening on your campus. So thinking about the critical mass of classes, whether or not there's designations that you can pull from, what disciplines are represented, is it happening for students across their time at the institution, from first year experiences to senior capstones, graduate level courses? Can you put together and put forth that story around the robustness of the curricular engagement? And then really also developing conceptual clarity about the aspects of community engaged learning that's taking place that help the students, community partners, staff and faculty understand that distinction. So whether you're talking about the kind of faculty or staff development training that's happening, connection to the mission and the learning opportunities for students, staff, and faculty, and even if there's learning opportunities for community partners connected to this. Next slide. Faculty rewards. I know we talk about this, and we've been talking about this for a long time, but really we know that the sustainability and institutionalization of this work happens when it's also connected to faculty reward systems. So if there's been language in tenure and promotion, making sure that that is shared, thinking about the ways that community engagement is recognized and rewarded at the institutions, and really taking this as an opportunity for self-study and engaging in study, dialogue, and reflection about how to explicitly promote a reward system connected to the scholarship or engaged scholarship at your campus more fully. And lastly, as we've sort of been moving in this direction, both with the Carnegie classification as well as in the broader field, really thinking and making a conscious effort to connect equity and community engagement, and thinking about the explicit connections and impacts of community engagement with systematically excluded or minoritized students and faculty, and where those connections are taking place, how your institution is connecting those two areas, and really the integration of those. Thinking about strategic priorities that may have been developed, especially within the last 2 years, that connect equity, diversity and inclusion with community engagement and student success will be part of the story that we'd like you to share. Next slide. On to you, Matthew.
Thanks, Marisol. We move on now to talking about assessment. It is very important that as a field, we are attending to continuous improvement. And so throughout the application, there are a variety of assessment questions that ask for your institution to be thinking about how you measure and assess the impact, but also the student learning outcome achievement of students who are engaged in community engagement, how you measure the impact on communities and community partnerships, and how you share that measurement with your partners for their feedback and ongoing continuous improvement of the partnerships. So there's a variety of ways that we ask you about this. We ask you about tracking, we ask you about measuring, we ask you about identifying and assessing student learning outcomes. Oftentimes institutions will report general student learning outcomes for things like civic engagement or attention to and concern for the community. That may or may not be particular to community engagement. What we are most interested here in is learning outcomes that are specifically tagged to the community engaged learning that students are doing. We're also interested in perceptions that community have about the community engaged work the institution is doing, and measuring the quality, depth, and impact of your partnerships along the way. So we will be asking many of those questions throughout the application. We're also interested, as I said in the definition earlier, in the impact that community engagement is having on your institution. And so we ask questions about systematic assessment of that impact on students, faculty, staff, and the institution, as well as your community partners. What I want to draw attention to here is the word systematic. You'll see that word used throughout many of the assessment questions. And by systematic, we mean a regular, repeatable cadence of collecting information, using that information to inform change, documenting the decisions to make change based on that information, and then repeating of a similar or the same measurement on a regular basis. So if you tell us, for example, that last year you did a collection process of the impact on partners, but there's no evidence that that collection process is done on an annual basis or on a regular basis, and you don't share with us that that information is used to improve practice, change policy, redesign program, that's not systematic. And so I wanted to just focus this slide on the use of the word systematic in each of those areas. We also want to think about how the institution is thinking about the pervasiveness of community engagement. So some of our assessment questions are fairly focused on student learning outcomes, for example, but some of our questions are focused on the campus-wide nature of your assessment program and asking you to think about the pervasiveness of community engagement across all aspects of your institution. So we ask you to think about that from a campus-wide perspective. And then we ask you to think about how you aggregate the smaller assessments into and share through a campus-wide reporting system. And so this is the focus of these 2 points here to get you thinking about your campus-wide approach.
All right, so I want to talk about application strategies. But before I do that, I just want to say I hope that everyone on this call is actually really excited about putting together an application. And I can picture a number of you sort of laughing, but we know this is a lot of work, but it's also a huge opportunity. And the opportunity is that the classification provides you with an excuse to do an intensive self-study, which, as with any self-study, will tell you a lot about what you're doing and how you can do it better. Right? That's what we really want to see you doing. And what we often say in workshops like this is it's not really about getting the classification. It's that we've provided you an excuse to do this self-study. So as you put together the application, let's think about the first-time application here. Always think about putting forward your best story. Like, what's the best evidence that you have? You've got to sort of make the case in your application. So how do you do that in a way that really tells the best story that you can? Most of the narratives in the first-time application are limited to 500 words. And we specifically ask that you don't provide web links. So if you take up your 500 words with web links, nothing will happen with those. We won't follow them. So don't use up space that way, right? And the 500 words is typically adequate space for you to provide evidence. Can you flip to the next one? All right, so reclassification, and because a lot of you are here for reclassification, is a little bit different. It's designed more than the first time for telling that story. And in fact, we ask you to provide narratives. So using evidence for all of the questions, but then weaving them into a narrative around what has happened since your last classification, what's going on now, and what's coming up in the future. And another point here is that just because you're coming back for reclassification, we're not interested in just more of whatever you were doing. We're looking at greater depth, right? So it's not like, do we have 10% more courses and does that mean we get reclassified? You may actually have decided to reduce your partnerships based on your last assessment and realize that you want to go deeper into fewer partnerships instead of spreading yourself so widely. And therefore the numbers look quite different. You can tell that story in a really powerful way in terms of how you understand the work in a deeper way. All right, can you flip to the next one? Yeah, I've already said this in terms of what exists, what's changed since the last classification, and then the supporting evidence. And there's room here for sort of the trajectory of where is this going, right? And then that sort of leads into the narrative of the next time that you reclassify. In the reclassification, we actually do ask for links in very specific areas, and we will follow those links. And then in rare cases, we may actually ask for a telephone conversation if we are just not, we just can't make sense out of the data we're looking for, we need more clarity. And so again, that's very different than the first time. All right, Marisol, you can pick it up here. And I'll also just say too that Marisol mentioned before that she's done this on her campus when she was at Laverne. She wrote a chapter about that work in the Carnegie book that we did. So you're the person here to talk about like how to put together a really great application.
Great, thank you. Well, I'll start by giving some context to like how I put the application together, where I was at when I put the classification together. I was 6 months into a new job, a new institution, a new state, a new city, and learning, and with the presidential expectation that we achieve Carnegie. So I was freaking out a little bit, to be quite honest, because it is a lot of work. But it really gave me an opportunity as a newcomer, starting a brand new office from the ground up, to really look across the institution. And one of the things I was able to do was leverage the folks who'd been at the institution for a long time, who had deep relationships. So I had a supervisor who was a lifer at Laverne, a faculty, and then moved into a staff role. I had someone from the provost's office, our chaplain, and our faculty or teaching and learning and assessment person. And so this was the core team that made up, the group. Like, we're the ones who were putting all the data together. But we also had the support of the president's office, folks across campus knew. So, one of the things I would say is that making sure that folks across the campus know that your president or chancellor is interested in this helps open doors and provide access to information. So making sure that you have those relationships and something comes from your executive leader to the campus, and then really building a team that is cross-institutional, that also has their own relationships that can help gather the data and pulling it together. The other piece is having a coherent voice in the application, I think, is really important too. And so while folks in our team wrote different pieces of it, I was really able to pull those pieces together and make sure that we had a consistent voice, and then send that back to the team for review and edits and other things. But we were also able to leverage kind of a second layer of the team, which were the deans and other institutional leaders, to help us make sure that we were able to pull the information that we needed when we were looking for the amount of hours that our Greek organizations were doing, or the investments that we made in the local community through partnerships with the city of Laverne or Pomona, right? We were able to get those numbers easily because we had those other leaders on campus. So really thinking broadly. The other aspect of it is really thinking about how you tie the self-study, which in my case was so helpful for thinking about what had already been the investment from the institution around community engagement, and then what could the possibilities be afterwards. So really then set a framework for me moving forward in terms of the evolution and development of community engagement across Laverne. But thinking about other places that you can link this to, so whether it's campus Campus Compact Civic Action Plan, right? This is complementary to the Carnegie or your institution's strategic plan, making sure that you have access to those documents and you're putting them together and seeing how they can support one another. And thinking about this, again, for the whole campus, not just part of the campus. This is not just for your community engagement office, right? That's what the Civic Action Plan can be. But this is for across campuses. So if you are an institution that has multiple campuses, making sure you're including those voices, right? Making sure you're thinking about the variety of students you have, whether it's traditional undergrads, graduate students, non-traditional adult students, making sure that they're also reflected and their experiences are also reflected, and what we do for them are reflected in this. And then don't leave any blanks. There were areas that we hadn't gotten to yet, right? We were at the beginning. And so we were honest about that. Like, we haven't done this, but this is the investment that we've made in this. And so being able to tell that whole story where, we're not trying to get stars on everything. We're trying to be real and seeing really, again, as a self-study, what are the areas that we can do more work in with more investment, because you also want to share this back with your institutional leaders, whether you receive the classification or not, around the ways that this work can continue to be supported on our campuses moving forward. And even if leadership changes, right? And we know that there's a lot of that happening at our institutions now. Next slide.
Thanks so much, Marisol. So for a reminder, this is also not just a first-time classification, but also a reclassification. We have the 2 upcoming cycles. The 2024 cycle timeline, again, the framework will be available starting in January 2022. We're making final details preparations at this time, and are looking forward to releasing it to you all. The application deadline will be April of 2023, so we can begin a review process. And then campuses will be notified internally in December of 2023 before the public announcement in January 2024. We will follow that with the 2026 cycle. The applications being available starting in January 2024, with a similar model of being due April 2025, notifications in December 2025, and public announcement in January 2026. And again, this is for both the first-time classification, but also for reclassification campuses.
And Lauren, if I could just jump in, just to remind folks, this is different than what you've experienced in the past. It used to be on a 5-year cycle, but you don't need to wait 5 years again to be able to do the first time. So if, for instance, you feel like you're not ready right now to do the 2024, then you don't have to wait 5 years. You can do it in 2026.
Perfect. And to clarify too, since we did shift from a 10-year reclassification to a 6-year reclassification, for campuses that classified in 2015 were originally eligible for reclassification in 2025. You can select to reclassify in 2024, this upcoming cycle, or wait until 2026 and will maintain your classification through that 2026 time. If you were classified earlier than 2015 and missed and has not yet reclassified, you have to fill out a first-time classification, and you're not able to submit a reclassification at that time. So for more resources, some of you asked for the book title in the chat. I believe that was shared through links, but here's an image of that title, The Elective Carnegie Communication Classification, edited by Dr. Saltmarsh and Dr. Johnson, and it features many chapters from different perspectives, including one from Marisol talking about forming a campus committee, for example. We're also creating a guide that will accompany both applications to offer additional information on the questions and sections of the framework that help to guide what we're asking about and give some more kind of information on and offer clarity as to the different sections of the application. We also invite you to monitor the Commission on Public Purpose in Higher Education's website as the administrative home of the classification. That is publicpurpose.org. There we'll offer further resources and information on upcoming webinars and workshops, as well as how to request such training for groups of campuses. So now we'll open up the Q&A. We ask that if you have any questions to please use the hand raising feature, and we can also call across anybody, or to continue to add Q&A questions into the chat. One of the questions that came through is, are there any one-on-one advisors that can support individual universities regarding questions for their classification? I'm not sure if, John, you want to take that one?
Lauren, say that again, would you?
Sure. The question is, are there any one-on-one advisors or consultants that can support individual universities regarding their questions for the classification?
Yeah, that's great. So we are putting together a consulting team. Those individuals will be available to work with campuses. I'm guessing, and Lauren, you can correct me here, but we should have that team kind of available to campuses by the middle of the spring semester. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, that is correct. I'll just jump in here, John. We will be available to consult with groups of campuses from the home office, and also be providing recommendations to trained consultants later in the spring.
Yeah, and so to Matthew's first point, none of us on this call will work with campuses individually, but if you convene a group of campuses, absolutely, we'd be happy to meet with you.
I'm sure Campus Compact will continue the kind of support that we've provided in the past around particularly members applying for the Carnegie classification.
Thanks all. The next question that we have in the Q&A is, do you recommend any specific assessment tools? For example, how to assess community partnership perspectives or other kinds of institutional partnerships?
Matthew, you want to take that one?
Sure. So there's a variety of different ways that campuses have assessed there's a variety of different ways that campuses have used assessment tools. Some have chosen to use certain questions in NESI or in SERP and triangulate those questions with more detailed local surveys. Others have done quantitative and qualitative mixed methods assessments, interviewing community partners. And some have used other approaches that were developed locally or through vendors that they have hired, consultants that they have hired to reach those assessments. The fact of the matter is there aren't really good tools off the shelf. And so we are pulling together some tools that we know campuses have used in the past to measure what you're talking about. But the particularities of partnerships in focus, there aren't really good tools for that. In terms of campus-wide assessment, the NASI is a fairly good assessment, but we have seen other assessments used as well, and are open to any kind of assessment. We're agnostic about type of assessment. What we're most interested in is that you are assessing, that there's evidence you're using that data collected to then make changes in policy and to improve your approach to community engagement moving forward.
And I would just add to that, Matthew, I think that was really helpful. The foundation has made it really clear to us that we don't endorse any particular products, right? And there are a lot of these tools out there. And as Matthew said, some of them are really good for some purposes and some need to be adapted. And so in the applications, we see a lot of different tools, but we don't endorse any particular tool.
Excellent. We have a number of questions in the Q&A and the chat asking for clarification about what years data should come for in the 2024 cycle and again in the 2026 cycle, especially regarding the fact that because of COVID, many data institutions have had their data be changed or altered, or complications with engagement. So again, some clarity onto what kind of data should be used and how to kind of clarify that within the application.
So typically we would ask for the last full year of your academic data. And I say that typically. So typically for this application, which is available in 2022, you should have full year academic data for 2020 to 2021. However, given the pandemic, you may decide that the best data you have, in other words, data which hasn't been tainted by the pandemic, is a prior academic year, and that's fine. What we do want to know is what academic year it's coming from, right? So if you decide that your, say, academic year 18-19 is the best data that you have because after that it gets messed up, then provide that data and then tell us that's the data that you're providing.
Excellent. Thank you, John. I'm searching for additional questions.
Okay.
Can I add to some of the assessment conversations? You know, one of the things that we did at my previous institutions was in the course evaluations that were community engaged courses, you know, added additional questions specific to that, and we're able to look at that data. So, you know, there are internal tools that you may be able to pull from. Also thinking about, you know, if your courses are tagged on your campus, and being able to pull those numbers, but being able to have the conversations about assessment and where you're pulling data early on and thinking about that as across the institution is going to be really important, especially when you begin to ask for that data and think about the years that you're going to be pulling that from. There also might be, you know, one of the things we've seen through the pandemic is some really amazing stories of the way institutions have pivoted or have changed their engagement to meet, you know, the needs and requests of communities. So, you know, utilizing those narratives to tell those stories, especially within the context of COVID, will be really important as well.
One of the questions, or a couple of the questions, are asking about systematic aspects of an application. As in, is there a general amount of time associated with establishing a systematic approach to assessments, and how that might be classified?
We don't ask that on the application. We want to know whether there are systems in place and whether the data that you have comes out of those systems. Another way of saying that is collecting the data simply for putting together the application is not a system, right? If you create a system in the process of collecting that data, which will then be ongoing, then you can consider that a systematic assessment, right? So I hope that answers that. You want to add something, Matthew?
Yeah, I would just say that many campuses put it into their annual or semi-annual or biannual assessment regime that their institutional research office would do. So they know, and maybe it's every year, maybe it's every 3 years, but it is systematic, and it may be that it is a layered system in the sense that there are semesterly components of the system tied to all community engaged coursework, for example, but there are other elements of the system that only happen every 3 years. What we're looking for is a system, just as you put it, John.
So there's also lots of questions being raised that I'm looking at, Lauren, around multi-campus institutions and how to do an application. So if you could maybe share a link to the policy, because we could take up a bunch of time there. The answer is really you have to decide whether you want to come in with all the campuses into one application, some of the campuses into one application, or separate applications. And there's a specific policy around that.
So one of the questions that just come up in the Q&A says, I appreciate that racial justice is being focused on within the new framework. How have community partners and movement leaders been involved in forming those questions and elements of the updated application?
I can answer that. So we have an advisory group, and the advisory group includes community partners. And that advisory group has been central in terms of the revisions of the application and the additional questions. I don't know if you want to add anything, Matthew or Marisol.
I would just add that we also look at the community partner feedback in the prior cycle, where we have asked for the first time for feedback from community partners on their engagement with institutions, and that was informative to the rethinking of the application. I would also say that in the end of the application framework, there were reflective questions, as there will be in the new framework, asking campus teams to think about the process and give us any feedback that they might have on their experience. And in several of those reflective comments, there was information shared about the impact of the process on partners and on what they had learned from partners. And in some cases, partner comments even were added that we took into account as well. So there are multiple avenues for us to consider the input of partners through the application framework process of the prior cycle, through the National Advisory Committee, through the open calls that we did for Zoom input on the framework as well. And we feel good that we have incorporated community partner feedback into the framework moving forward.
Yeah, that's great.
And the advisory committee itself is a diverse committee.
And if you want to see who's on the advisory committee, you can go to the website and see the members.
I think we have a question from Katie Larson on the call. I think her hand is raised. If Katie, you want to ask your question? Katie, it's going once, going twice.
And maybe Katie could also like unmute in the case that she is.
No, she said she had no question.
Okay. Yeah, she was multitasking.
Great. Another question is about how we might engage students in the classification process, if there are any suggestions or tips of involving students in the framework.
So I can jump in there, and I too have been a part of 2 campuses who have applied for the classification in prior roles. And I've seen this happen on several campuses through the 2020 cycle, that students are included in the application team. And that focus groups are often run with students, highly engaged students, as well as students who are not as highly engaged, to collect their impressions and their feedback on the community engagement at their institution. I've also seen institutions form and train students to be interview teams, to go out and interview community partners based on the questions that are provided in the framework that partners will be receiving through the application process, and have conversations with those partners about the meaning of those questions, the type of information that is being solicited through those questions, and learn how the community engaged practice on campus can be improved. And then those students collate that information and offer it to the application committee. So I think students can be as deeply involved as the committee sees fit to do so. And it's also a great learning experience for students along the way.
I'd like to add something connected to students, but a little bit different. I've seen, not specifically for Carnegie, but for other classifications, an institution I was at have like their communications department write the application, and they were not successful, right? So making sure your team has the people who are actually doing the work on campus is key, because we can speak to it more deeply, more authentically. And so we need to be the ones driving that work on the campus as part of the Carnegie classification. Don't just offload it to a department, like making sure that the folks that you're bringing towards that team, whether they be students, community partners, faculty, other folks across campus, are the ones who do this work and who can most authentically speak to it.
That's a great point, Marisol. And I would say the other thing we've seen is the institutional research office writing the application, which also tends not to be successful. I think what we hear from successful campuses is that the involvement of a broad swath of stakeholders in the process is a phenomenal educational opportunity to bring attention to and highlight and elevate community engagement across the campus in a new way. And really, that's the benefit of the process. And I hope that campuses take away from this call today the need to involve lots of people across campus in the conversation. It's really about the process and the conversation and the thinking that goes on in the process and the conversation about that definition, to take us back to the beginning, that there is a purpose and a process to community engagement that is important and that all on campus who are involved in need to understand.
So I think we have time for one last question. And the question is going to be about GivePulse and how campuses can best utilize GivePulse within the application process. And there's going to be additional trainings available for navigating the different aspects of GivePulse. So George, maybe you want to step in for us and talk to us about how institutions can best support or utilize this platform.
Yeah, I'm gonna add my own spotlight here now. Yeah, so in the coming year, we're gonna be providing additional trainings via Zoom, as well as additional resources where you can actually download via PDF. Basically, the whole idea is to provide as much educational resources and walking tours to ensure that everyone is able to access the system and apply, and pretty much we'll be the partners to help guide you through the whole process every step of the way.
Thanks so much, George. Look forward to collaborating with you on that. So lastly, I'd like to thank everybody for attending today's webinar. Please access our website with any further questions you have. We have a lot of resources available now, and more will be coming in the following months after we release the application in January. You're also welcome to email us at carnegieclassifications@albion.edu with additional questions, and we'll be happy to try to support you as you work for your application, and look forward to speaking with you soon. Thanks all for attending today's webinar, and good luck with your applications. We look forward to reading them in the coming years.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, George.
Yeah.